Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to look at one of the specific areas of interviewing that I don't think is discussed quite often enough, and that is the difference between interviewing men and women. And helping us to do so is expert and psychologist Paul Clifford from Paul Clifford Psychology. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks, James. Thanks. Great to be here.
Tell me a bit about your background, Paul, and the type of work you do.
Yeah, well, I did a psychology degree and started in recruitment. I had sort of mapped out a bit of a plan for where I would go, and it started with recruitment and did about 10 years in that, both in-house and then agencies as well. And I could have continued with recruitment. I was really enjoying it, but I thought I wanted to progress to the next stage, and that was to be a human resources consultant. So got a job with that. And then after 3 years, I then moved into organisational psychology.
So are there differences between men and women in the workplace, or is it a bit of a myth?
Well, I don't think it's in particular situations, I think. I mean, if you go into any workplace, you wouldn't necessarily look and go, oh, hang on a minute, women are doing this and men are doing that. But I think it's more in regards to at various decision points. So whether that's around making decisions about, what are we going to do, strategic decisions, but particularly when we look at then putting ourselves forward for jobs, for instance. I think that's when, when it's about, me as a person, that's when I think the differences sort of come to the fore, if you like.
So what are some of those differences and what are the impacts that they have on applications?
Well, I think the sort of the basis of it is around gender roles, if you like, and whether, there are various stereotypes, if you like, around gender roles. The stereotype for a woman is to be more kind of demure and agreeable. The stereotype for men is to be more perhaps outspoken, assertive, competitive, if you like. And the research supports that as well. And so there are obvious play out in terms of stereotypes where people show that they believe in that stereotype. And then there can be more implicit behaviour where the person doesn't really even kind of fully realise that they are buying into that stereotype.
So that's sort of an unconscious bias towards that?
That's right, yeah, that's right. And so a behaviour that might seem a bit innocuous is in fact that stereotype sort of playing out. Now, there's varying degrees by which that stereotype might play out. You might find one context where it's actually playing out a lot, and in a different context it's not really playing out much at all. So it's not like all men will do it. Some men won't do it at all. Some men will do it. Some women will respond differently. But the research suggests that if you look at any cohort of people, there is a significant difference where more on balance it's playing out and in favour of men over women because of this gender stereotype. So what happens is you go into interview and then women feel there's a natural inclination to feel that they need to play the female role, which is more agreeable. The men feel like they can play the more aggressive, assertive, competitive role, and the danger is that the stereotype around leadership is that it's a aggressive, assertive, competitive type role. So you've got male and female stereotype, and the stereotype around leadership falls on the male side.
There's been a lot of research into this, and statistically, men like to fluff things up a little bit, whereas women like to actually meet every part of the key selection criteria and answer very honestly, whereas men have the ability to, I suppose, sugarcoat things a little bit and present themselves in a way that, perhaps is not necessarily 100% accurate. They like to sugarcoat it a little bit. So I think it's important that we stick to the key selection criteria when we're interviewing both women and men, and make sure that we are actually asking questions that will have a transparent outcome, not questions that are able to be I suppose, emphasised or brought into a light that isn't necessarily accurate or reflective. So being able to be fair across that process for all gender, not just men and women, there are other genders as well that play a part in this. It all comes down to equality and fairness.
Paul, we've heard today from a number of TA leaders that female applicants will normally read a job advertisement and only apply once they feel like they may meet nearly all the criteria.
Yep.
Whereas male applicants are quite different. They're much happier to apply only meeting a few of the criteria. Mm-hmm. Is it the same in the interview room?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think that there's to some degree, a bit of a care factor. I think that males are probably, on balance, more likely to, not care as much potentially about, because they're not conflicted in their role. They feel they can be forward and they can, advance themselves and promote themselves without kind of being conflicted, right? I think women tend to be more conflicted, on balance, and therefore, when it comes to the interview questions, it's almost like they're evaluating each question and going, okay, don't overstate yourself here. Make sure that you're being, quite honest and following the rules. Whereas I think guys are, generally speaking, a little less concerned about that. I mean, there is research around deceptive behaviour in interviews, which does demonstrate that males on balance are more likely to be deceptive. So, it might be the little white lie kind of thing. That will probably play out in interview as well.
So what can organisations and interviewers do given this information? Well,
so I think the other thing that plays out in interviews as well is that if you've got a particular bias, so if the men have got a particular bias, you can actually be transmitted to the female candidate. And because the female candidate is more likely to be thinking, okay, what role am I supposed to be playing here? Whereas the male interviewee is probably going, I don't really care so much. Then they're going to pick up on the cues. Okay, so if you're a male interviewer and you've kind of decided, or unconsciously transmitting a view that, I'm not sure this woman is fitting the stereotype, they can send a signal. The woman can pick up on that signal and go, oh, so I'm not doing so well here, and then they become even more agreeable and even less confident in putting their points of view forward. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it comes back to, there's a number of different things we can talk about in terms of what organisations and recruiters do. But if you're talking about actually in the interview itself, you need to increase your level of awareness around what you're doing and how you might be inadvertently sending a signal to a candidate that I actually don't think this is going as well as what you might be thinking, or I've kind of made up my mind. The idea around suspending judgment, I talk about, because I do some clinical work as well, and I talk to clients about the idea of suspending judgment. The idea, we all make judgments and we make decisions, but you can make a decision about a particular interview question, but try not to make a decision about halfway through the interview about whether this candidate is right or not. Suspend that judgment.
Oh, it happens all the time too, doesn't it?
And that's right.
And it is a conscious thing that you need to do and remind yourself of. Mm-hmm. And I catch myself all the time, reminding myself that a good first impression is good, but now we've got to have the whole interview. So
correct.
I think there are some considerations when you're interviewing men and women. In my own experience, I have found that women are much more to the point on the question. They don't add the colour and flavour in the sell. Men tend to be a bit more confident in their answers and maybe are able to feel more confident in taking a leap of faith on the new role. So I think it's not letting the noise in the interview or the extra sentences blow you away, but have a look at what you're really looking for in the candidate, how the question was answered. I think that's probably the tip that I'd give on that front.
So what are some of the other things that organisations can do more broadly?
Well, I think that it's kind of like three stages. There's sort of pre-interview, during interview, and then post. All three. There's things to do at all three. So the prior to there's probably arguably there's most of the work pre, and this is about defining the job properly. So the idea that you've got to put some more thought into it, make sure is the position description up to date. But it's actually sometimes more than that, because sometimes it's like you look at a particular job and go, okay, well we need these kinds of competencies. But the next level of analysis is going, but what do we know actually creates success in the role? So as an example, in terms of consulting roles, when I was working in a consulting firm, I used to recruit for consultants, and I used to reflect on, okay, we can put down a bunch of competencies, but what do I reckon has been the competencies that have led us to be effective in the role? And it would be, say, being influential. People might say, well, that's a bit of left field. And you kind of go, well, if you can't influence your clients as your value proposition, then you're not going to get too far as a consultant. So that might be a competency that can kind of tend to be overlooked. It wouldn't necessarily be something you'd think firsthand, right? So it's sometimes the trouble with a capability framework is you go to the capability framework and you go, oh, okay, which of these will I choose, right? And just put them in the job description, as opposed to going, let's do a real analysis of this particular job and the success factors, right? So, and this is also a question of how much time people have, right? So some people will go, oh, I haven't got time for that. And I can understand
some of our
that,
other coaching videos that we've done in this series with Ross, we talk about the job description needs to be updated. And then you need to drill it down to the top 5 or 6 key competencies. And from those 5 or 6 competencies, that's what we're going to base our interview questions on.
That's right.
So the other parts of the job are important, but there's 5 things that are the most important. And we've got a limited time in the interview, so we need to concentrate our questions on those top competencies.
Correct, absolutely.
Do female candidates feel more comfortable in an interview being conducted by another female or by a male, or is there no clear data either way?
It's not necessarily a fact. I've actually seen some research that suggests that it depends on competence.
Okay.
And that female interviewers will sort of bias someone who's kind of not so threatening as far as competence is concerned, and actually perhaps help them lift them up. But if there's a person at a equal or higher level of competence, they may actually disadvantage a woman just as much as what a male might. So, because women can hold the same stereotypes, same gender stereotypes. So a woman can go into, as the interviewee, and hold the stereotype, for instance, that I need to be demure and agreeable, for instance. And so therefore a female interviewer can therefore hold the same and then judge the woman against the same criteria.
If we have 2 people doing the interviewing, maybe a male and a female, are we less likely to come across some of these issues, or are we twice as more likely to come across them?
Yeah, well, it depends on it depends on the 2 individuals and what kind of attitudes and stereotypes they have. So if they've both got the stereotypes, then yes, it could be double the trouble, because both of them might transmit some signals to the candidate. Both might come to the evaluation process and then go, but he's really gunning for this. Great. Oh, she's a bit assertive, isn't she? So same behaviour but viewed differently. So, look, I think that it does go back to an equality issue as well. Regardless of who you've got interviewing, raise the level of awareness around how these things impact. Be aware of what the research says. get your mindset into a purely objective mindset, regardless of put gender aside.
Yeah.
It's we've got a person in front of us.
I guess to
What are
that
the
point, how do we
capabilities?
make sure we aren't overcompensating the other way? And so we're aware. I think I read an article that said every single person has got a gender bias. That's just part of their nature. So
Yep.
if we're trying to address that and we're trying to be neutral,
Yep.
is there a danger that we do go too far the other way? And how
Absolutely.
do we keep that in check?
Well, I mean, how we keep it in check is just to realise that, yeah, we might overcompensate. Because there'll be a logic in some people's heads that, okay, overall, there's more bias disadvantages women, so therefore I will try and balance it out. You know? But that's not necessarily, it's really just going to perpetuate the same, it's going to perpetuate bias. We're trying to eliminate bias, if you like. So yeah, absolutely, there's the potential for that to occur. I mean, human nature, once again, coming back to from a clinical field, is very common for people who've been in situations in which they've experienced some extreme behaviour to say, I'm going to be nothing like that. But what they do is they overcorrect and go to the other end. So the idea of overcorrecting is a lot of people rationalise it and say, yeah, fair's fair. We need to overcorrect.
Yeah.
We just got to. It just all comes back to trying to be objective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you're interviewing men and women, there can be some different dynamics. One thing that I prefer with all candidates is to have a minimum of 2 interviewers and preferably a male and a female, so there's diversity on your panel. A couple of things to be aware of when you're interviewing women is typically, and I'm going to say we, because I identify as a woman, we don't tend to put ourselves forward in the same way as men. Even when you're interviewing a sales candidate, and sales candidates typically tend to be a little bit more outgoing, even female sales candidates can be a little bit more reserved in their answers. So typically women apply for a role if they meet 80% or more of the criteria. And what we see happens in an interview is sometimes women will underplay their skill set because they're not comfortable selling themselves. So it's important as an interviewer to take that into account during the interview itself, probing a little bit more with questions, focusing on achievements and deliverables. And then when you're going back and reviewing your different candidates, it's important to have that in the back of your mind.
One thing that I've learned, Paul, and only recently, is that men tend to speak, when they're the male interviewer, they tend to speak far more when interviewing females as opposed to interviewing other men. So I think there's a real reminder there about the importance of being a good listener.
Yes.
Being a good active listener.
Yep.
Particularly if a female candidate is less likely to promote.
Correct.
But there might be some clues there in some of their answers. So
Yes.
I think regardless of who we're interviewing, being an active listener and making sure the candidate is speaking 80% of the time is vital.
Absolutely. There shouldn't be any reason why, as an interviewer, you're speaking any more than, say maximum 30% of the time. I mean, that 30% still seems like a lot. As you say, I think 80% for the candidate. There shouldn't be any reason for that. I mean, obviously, in the beginning, there's going to be, depending on what you want to transmit to the candidate about the nature of the role and so on, how we're going to do the interview and so on. There's obviously going to be more of the interviewer talking. But once it's really about asking its question and then asking another follow-up question and so on, and yes, from probing, but absolutely, 80% rule should apply as much as possible. Yeah.
We have a lot of job types which might be dominated by one gender or the other.
Yep.
But particularly for roles where it's very male dominated, if we're interviewing a female candidate, how should we address that to make sure that they're comfortable coming into an environment that's, say, 95% male dominated?
Yeah, well, I think it's one thing to think about is the nature of the language that we're using in terms of, say, an assumption around that certain types of outcomes require certain types of behaviours, right? So, for instance, this idea that leadership requires someone to be, say, assertive and competitive, and we put those two competencies at the top of the list. But we do know that that people in general, I was going to say women, but men and women apply a whole range of different behaviours to be effective in a leader. There's a whole range of different behaviours. So I think it's making sure that if there's a kind of a male-dominated role, that we don't fall into the habit of then going, oh, okay, so because there's been more males and there are more males, we need more male qualities, which makes an assumption about the criteria, and then that feeds through. So it's really thinking about, it's thinking about what actually do we know about what creates good leadership, and or what creates a good engineer, or whatever this so-called male role is, rather than assuming that it must be male traits because we've got mostly men doing it. Yeah.
It is easy to have that bias, right? You do tend to get on with, people more than others sometimes. And I think with interviewing people of different genders, you want to make sure that there's that consistency, but you also have to be aware of particular questions you might ask that could, appear discriminatory, or that someone could take in a way that they feel it might impact the outcome of their application. I think you should give, equal space for either gender or whichever gender to speak. So, to make sure that they have the same forum, they have the same, time to answer, they're asked the same questions.
Paul, anything else that you'd like to add in closing?
Look, I think that, I think we've talked about the objectivity. I think that, it's really comes down to being conscious, trying to raise the level, from an organisational point of view, raise the level of awareness, and just keep pumping out the message around objectivity. And the usefulness, it's all about, if you're going to sell something to somebody, it's what's in it for you, right? So if you're going to get the best candidate, yes, you might have to spend a little bit more time defining the role, but that time that you spend doing it will pay you back enormously when you find the candidate that does actually match what you really need and what you're really looking for. So, because everyone sort of goes into I'm really busy and, I've got so many interviews to do, and I can understand that. There can be compromises in the process as a result. And then you see the fact that candidate doesn't work out, they're not what we were hoping for, and then we have to potentially redo the process again. Yeah.
Paul, thanks very much for joining us today.
No worries, pleasure.